It's a cultural opportunity for students and the community to explore the rich heritage of St. Bernard as Nunez Community College and Penn TV presents the Nunez History Lecture Series.
After absorbing this territory into its boundaries, into its political power, the United States spent a great deal of money defending the state of Louisiana. And the United States of America did so particularly because of what happened in the state of Louisiana during the War of 1812. During the War of 1812, of course, British forces ranged all over the American coast, on the Atlantic coast and in the Gulf Coast. Using ground forces and naval forces, they were able to capture and make significant gains within American territory. And they made gains at Baltimore, Maryland, at Washington, D.C., at Mobile Bay, Alabama, and then also here at New Orleans. Of course, the famous story is that a British expeditionary force that departed Jamaica in late 1814, was able to sail across the Gulf of Mexico and land forces through Lake Bourne here in St. Bernard Parish. Those forces were able to close in on the city where they met Lyon Jackson on the plain of Chalmette. The Battle of Chalmette followed on January 8, 1815, the largest single ground action in the War of 1812, and it was decisive and important. The British were stopped there, but moving into the post-war period, British actions at Baltimore, at Washington, D.C., at New Orleans were significantly influential in the way that the United States government considered building coastal defenses in the post-War of 1812 period. What the U.S. government did immediately after the War of 1812 was reach a decision that it was necessary for a permanent system of fortifications to be built. The construction of a permanent system would be based on what the British did during the War of 1812, and it would also be based on the areas that were regarded as being strategically important across the United States. This is a diagram of the permanent system that was built in the period immediately after the War of 1812. Beginning in 1817 and continuing into the 1870s, this permanent series of fortifications, of course, was all along the Atlantic coast of the United States, on the Gulf Coast of the United States, even with a few examples on the west coast of the U.S. Now, the very first fortifications would be built on the Gulf Coast, where the Battle of New Orleans was of particular influence. Now, you'll notice in an inset here a number of fortifications here around the mouth of the Mississippi River, Mobile Bay, Alabama, some of the coastal islands on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. This inset here shows you where the particularly heavy concentration of fortifications was in New England, in the New Jersey, Virginia, Maryland, Maine, Connecticut, New York area. And then you'll even notice way out on the west coast, Alcatraz and Fort Point. Alcatraz Island, which is now famous as a prison, it served as a prison for a long time. Alcatraz was actually, to begin with, a permanent fortification. Now, the perimeter of defenses that the U.S. government built to defend and protect the city of New Orleans stretched rather far out. They, in some cases, were as far out as Mississippi. The first fortification we're going to discuss was Fort Massachusetts on Ship Island, Mississippi. This fortification was built beginning in 1859. It was still under construction when the Civil War began in 1861. But Fort Massachusetts, even out on faraway Ship Island, you can see it here on the monitor, even out on Ship Island, it was designed to defend and protect the city of New Orleans. Now, this is how it plays into that picture. In the War of 1812, in the year 1814, when a British expeditionary force came to capture the city of New Orleans, that expeditionary force sailed up from Jamaica and anchored in the channel immediately north of Ship Island. It's a natural deep water anchorage where the water is naturally about 30 feet deep. The biggest ships, the biggest sailing ships in the world, could move into that anchorage, weigh anchor, and they could ride out even a pretty hardcore hurricane, protected by the island, by that barrier island. You can see that in this photograph. This is a photograph showing you Ship Island with Fort Massachusetts circled here. And this photograph is especially interesting because you can see that deep water anchorage. If you'll notice this sort of lightly colored area right here, this is the north side of the island. This lightly colored area marks shallow water, water that's only about waist deep. But then you get to this dark water beginning right in here, and that dark water marks what everyone thinks of as the Ship Island anchorage, where the water, or the bottom drops down to about 30 feet. And again, in this time period, when the only warships that were being used, this was in the time period before nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers, this is when the only warships that a nation had in its power were sail-driven. Sail-driven warships could move into that deep water on the protected side of Ship Island, anchor, and ride out storms, and then they could also use the island itself as a base of operations. The British would use Ship Island as an anchorage, and when the British sent in troops to capture the city of New Orleans, those troops would move away from Ship Island through Lake Bourne, through Bayou Bienvenue, ultimately landing here in St. Bernard Parish. But we'll get to a little bit more detail about that as we move along in the presentation. One of the other things that I'm going to be discussing is the evolution of fortifications throughout the time period beginning in 1817 and continuing all the way to World War II. Fortifications would evolve. They would begin as massive brick structures, and then they would ultimately end up as smaller, much more humble structures. Also, I'm going to be discussing the evolution of the weapons that would be used in these fortifications. Things ranging from 32-pounder smoothbore guns. In this time period, in the time period of the 1820s and 1830s, the heaviest weapon that was available was a cannon that would fire a 32-pound round ball. The way that the evolution would cycle itself, so when you get to the 20th century, you're no longer using a gun that is capable of firing a 32-pound round ball accurate at 1.5 miles, but you have weapons capable of firing a 1,200-pound projectile that's conical shaped at ranges of 8, 9, and 10 miles. So there's a significant evolution not only in the construction methods for the fortifications in the Gulf, but also in the types of weapons and the effectiveness of the weapons that are being used. Back to Ship Island. Now, Ship Island has this lovely little fort on it, and Fort Massachusetts is interesting in its shape and form. You can see here the fort is oriented toward the west, actually facing toward the city of New Orleans, and it has this rounded front and then a straight back. This is actually the waterfront. This is where the main battery would be. The main battery would be a battery of 32-pounder smoothbore guns, cannon firing a 32-pound round ball, and they would be on 2 levels. Now you can see these little arched rooms that are on the interior, on the 2nd level. The arched rooms are called casemates, and they're protective rooms with very thick brick walls. Inside each one of those rooms would be a 32-pounder gun, a very heavy gun, and then there was also a roof battery. And you can see these emplacements ringing the outside perimeter of the fort here. Those are all emplacements for cannon. So you had basically a stacked armament situation where you had a 32-pounder gun on the lower level in what is called a casemate, and then on the roof, guns as well. So you had one layer of guns above the other. That maximized the number of guns that could point on one strategic area. And in this case, the strategic area was only a few hundred feet off the fort in the deep water anchorage. So any ship that wanted to use that anchorage had to move into the range of gunfire of 2 levels of heavy guns. That would make it possible for the people, determined troops inside this fort, to keep anyone out and to prevent any enemy shipping from making use of the strategic anchorage there at Ship Island. And you can see a little bit better shot of the interior of the fort here, where you can see not only the gun mounts on the roof battery, but you can also see the casemates that would house the weapons on the lower level. Now, Fort Massachusetts is somewhat of a small fortification, but the locality of the island doesn't really necessitate a large fort. You can get by with a very small fort. You can get by with a fort mounting about 30 guns at the maximum. You can get by with that because no ship would be able to use the anchorage unless they were very close to where this fort is located. You can get by with 30 guns controlling the anchorage because any ship that would have to move into the anchorage would have to move into the gunfire umbrella of these 30 guns. You didn't need 100 guns. You could get by with 30 just fine. And I'd also point out an interesting architectural feature is this tower right here. There's a round stair tower with these beautifully ornate granite stairs and a circular staircase that ascends up to the 2nd level. Fort Massachusetts is run as part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, which is a National Park Service site. There's regular ferry service out to Fort Massachusetts from Gulfport, Mississippi. If you ever get a chance to go out there, it makes for a great day trip, and it's a beautiful little fort to visit. The next fort we're going to talk about was a fort that was on the southern side of the defenses of New Orleans. Now, Fort Massachusetts on Ship Island was up here. Fort Livingston is right here. This body of water right here is a tributary called Barataria Bay, and Barataria Bay is very similar to the Lake Borgne tributary, Lake Pontchartrain. It's broad and it's shallow. But Barataria Bay was an avenue of approach to New Orleans, and that's what this whole defensive system was designed to guard. It was designed to guard all of the various avenues of approach to the city of New Orleans. New Orleans, unlike many cities in the country, was vulnerable from multiple sides. It was vulnerable from this area here, the Lake Borgne side, which is how the British got ashore in 1814, vulnerable from the mouth of the river, which is down here, vulnerable from Barataria Bay, and then vulnerable from this area as well, although a little bit less so. Barataria Bay was a point of vulnerability because any ship could pull up right off of the island. If you've ever been to Grand Isle, that's Grand Isle right there. Right across from Grand Isle at the mouth of Barataria Bay is an island called Grand Terre, and that's where Fort Livingston would be built. Vessels could pass into Barataria Bay, sail up to the northern extreme of the bay, and then using this little bayou right here, that's Bayou Lafourche, could pass from Barataria Bay to Lake Salvador to Lake Catatouche, and if you could get into that lake, you're barely 15 miles from the city of New Orleans. So using the Barataria Bay tributary, you could get within walking distance of the city of New Orleans. And it was recognized very early on that this was a way that an enemy could deliver ground troops very close to the city. So it's a point of vulnerability. The United States government comes in and builds a fort right at the mouth of Barataria Bay to prevent anyone from being able to move in and out of that tributary. The U.S. government builds Fort Livingston, but Fort Livingston doesn't survive intact like Fort Massachusetts has. This is Barataria Pass. Over here is Grand Isle, right here is Grand Terre, and this is what's left of Fort Livingston. Fort Livingston was begun in 1841. Construction continued into the Civil War period and continued after the Civil War period, but the fort doesn't look at all like it once did, and that's because of a hurricane that came in 1915. As you know, hurricanes threatened this area, especially the coastal area, even more so. A hurricane blew up out of the Gulf in 1915 that knocked about half of Fort Livingston off into the Gulf of Mexico. The result that you get is a fort that has been ruptured. This is actually part of where the fort met its primary waterfront. And when I refer to a waterfront, that's that stretch of fort that faces the strategic waterway. So you don't have to have the fort built up with heavy guns all the way around. You wanted just the heaviest guns pointing toward the strategic waterway. And in this case, it's the mouth of Barataria Bay. You had the heaviest guns pointing toward the mouth of Barataria Bay. There was some armament on the backside of the fort defending the land approach to the fort, but you didn't need that heavy an armament. As it's worked out at Barataria Bay, the heaviest concentration of guns would have been on the south wall, and the south wall fell off into the Gulf of Mexico during that hurricane in 1915. And this is a shot just to give you an idea of how ruptured the walls are. This is part of the approach to the south wall, and as you can see, it's all just ruptured and split away, and there are even large chunks of masonry in the wash right there. Fort Livingston is a lot like many of the forts in this state in the sense that they are abandoned. There are 8 fortifications of the permanent system in the state of Louisiana. 2 of them are run as parks. The rest are abandoned and largely forgotten, many of them on state property, some of them on private property. But only 2 out of 8 are administered and run and interpreted as historic sites. Fort Livingston is an example of one of the ones that is abandoned and forgotten. It's actually property of the state of Louisiana, but because of its remoteness and because it is largely inaccessible, the only way to get there is by boat. It is abandoned and forgotten, and nobody takes care of it, and nobody does anything to interpret its interesting history. The result is that if you get out there, you find a fort that doesn't have bathrooms, doesn't have a snack bar, and doesn't have a gift shop. And it's got a lot of snakes, too. Fort Jackson. Fort Jackson is located on the Mississippi River, actually on the west bank of the Mississippi River, about 75 miles south of the city of New Orleans. Fort Jackson was begun in 1822, so it is one that is relatively early in the overall picture of the permanent system of fortifications, because keep in mind, the system began in 1817 and continued into the 1870s. Fort Jackson, being started in 1822, is relatively early. The only one that is any earlier than Jackson is Fort Pike, which is at the Wrigley's on the eastern side of the city of New Orleans. That was begun as early as 1819. Fort Jackson begins in 1822, and Jackson, its location is of particular strategic importance. Fort Jackson's located at a bend in the Mississippi River. Everybody calls it Plaquemine Bend. And this bend in the river was strategically valuable because any sailing ship, and keep in mind the time period we're discussing here, the 1820s, the 1830s, ships, their only source of power and mobility is the wind. Sailing ships approaching this bend in the Mississippi River would have to slow down as they made the bend, as they negotiated the bend in the river. So any ship having to slow down would obviously be in a vulnerable position. It didn't even have speed to get it quickly through the umbrella of gunfire of a fortification. Working even more against the ships was the fact that the river current is very strong. The current of the Mississippi River down there is as much as 6 miles an hour, so that if you have a ship that is capable of moving at 10 miles an hour, the current coming at your bow would slow you down to a forward speed of about 4 miles an hour. So for a large sailing ship to be able to fight the current and also make that turn, it put that ship in a really vulnerable position. And it's for that reason that even during the pre-American period, even before Louisiana became a U.S. state, that the Spanish and the French also built fortifications right at this bend in the river called Plaquemine Bend. In fact, the French started it with a fort called Fort Bourbon, and then the Spanish would come in and build a fort on the other side of the river, but we'll get to that fort in a minute. Fort Jackson is a different kind of design than the other forts that you've seen before this. Fort Jackson is what's called a pentagonal bastioned fort, meaning that it's a pentagram, it's 5-sided, and it has defensive projections at each point of the pentagon. And those, you can see them here. There's one bastion here, one bastion here. And the word bastion has its origins in French. And the interesting thing is that all of the architectural features of these fortifications have French names. And that's because when the United States began this permanent system of fortifications, the U.S. government actually hired a French military architect by the name of Simon Bernard to come over. He had actually been on the general staff for Napoleon Bonaparte and was a published and studied military architect. The U.S. government gave him a commission as a major general, brought him to the United States of America, and he designed most of the forts of the permanent system. He stayed in the United States for about 15 years working just on this system of fortifications. Ultimately, the U.S. government would build about 40 of these permanent brick forts. Simon Bernard would actually stand as the supervising engineer and the designing architect on about half of them. This is one of Bernard's forts, 5-sided, right on the bank of the Mississippi River. Any ship coming up the river getting into the turn would come right under the direct gunfire of Fort Jackson. Fort Jackson even has a little water moat here. Everyone has the typical, romantic images of things like alligators prowling the moat, but that's not the case. The only living creature I have ever seen in this moat is a nutria. And the result of having this water moat circling the fort is that you get a significant amount of sludge and nasty muck buildup in the fort. The way it was designed was that the river would actually feed this wet moat, and the purpose of the wet moat was defensive. If infantry somehow got ashore and approached this fort with the idea of attacking it, they wouldn't be able to get directly up to the walls of it, at least not without having to wade through 4 or 5 feet of water. And what that would do would be to slow the enemy down. That would slow infantry down as they approached the fortification. And then there were also outworks. There were also fortifications built on the outside of Fort Jackson that would slow infantry down as well. So the fort served not only a strategic purpose in terms of guarding the river, but it also was tactically there to protect itself. And a fort, just in its very basic design function, was just simply something to house and protect heavy artillery. And so there was a great deal of effort placed into designing and perfecting the strategic defenses of the fort, so that if an enemy was approaching it, you had things like a water moat, you had things like earthworks on the outside of the fort that would tend to slow that infantry down so that they couldn't just charge right up to the brick walls of the work and go to work in a siege. Well, Fort Jackson was also the scene of an interesting battle in the American Civil War. And it was interesting on a number of levels. First of all, it was the largest exchange of cannon fire that, in world history by 1862. It was, of course, soon surpassed thereafter. But in April 1862, Rear Admiral David Glasgow Farragut of the United States Navy led a squadron of U.S. Navy warships up the Mississippi River past Confederate garrisons in this fort and also the fort on the other side of the river, Fort St. Philip. And as Farragut's fleet passed Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, over 300 artillery pieces were all firing at one time. Farragut would pass Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip and continue up the river because he had a new scientific invention that worked toward his benefit. By the time 1861 had rolled around, ships were no longer dependent on the wind to move from place to place because the steam engine had been adopted. So that Farragut's ships come up the Mississippi River powered by steam engines, and they're able to go right past Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip without having to worry about getting a wind to push them. And that's part of the reason that these forts and their effectiveness are seriously degraded. The forts in 1825, they would have been formidable obstacles, but in 1865 they really weren't. In 1825, ships were disadvantaged because they had to depend on the wind, but in 1865, ships no longer had to depend on the wind, and ships were in a more advantaged position. So, getting into the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, these brick fortifications that the U.S. government spent tons of money on, these brick fortifications were no longer quite as effective as they were earlier in the 19th century. But then there's also Fort St. Philip, immediately across the Mississippi River from Fort Jackson, on the east bank of the Mississippi River, in Lower Plaquemine. Fort St. Philip is interesting because it predates the United States of America. Well, at least it predates Louisiana being a part of the United States of America. It was begun by the Spanish during the Spanish colonial period, commenced in 1786, construction continues into the 1790s. The Spanish used it as a defensive feature, that is, until the Spanish gave it back to the French temporarily in 1800 with the Treaty of San Ildefonso. But then the French, after regaining this fort, sell everything to the United States in 1803. The United States acquires this fort as part of the Louisiana Purchase. This fort stands as something that is quite interesting because of the fact that it was garrisoned by U.S. troops during the War of 1812. When the British threatened to send an expeditionary force to Louisiana in 1814, 1815, the United States sent regular troops and militia down to occupy Fort St. Philip. And as part of the overall Battle of New Orleans, a British naval force came down around the mouth of the river, sailed up the Southwest Pass, attempted to sail up to Plaquemine Bend with the idea of getting all the way up to the city of New Orleans here. And what the plan was that the Royal Navy, the British Navy, would support the ground troops that were operating in St. Bernard Parish around the Chalmette battlefield. The whole point was that you had the perfect meeting of naval forces and ground forces. The ground forces working their way through the eastern approaches to the city, and then the British Navy comes up the river to the city. And that those two forces converging on the target simultaneously would lead to victory for the British. Well, it didn't happen, and the Royal Navy was never able to get into the Battle of New Orleans because they were stopped at Plaquemine Bend by U.S. troops in Fort St. Philip. Fort St. Philip, like I said, built by the Spanish originally, updated by the U.S. in the period of around 1813 or so, and occupied by U.S. soldiers. It today is totally abandoned. It sits on private property, but it makes for quite an interesting visit. It's like you're rummaging through the Venezuelan jungle when you go down there. There are alligators everywhere, lots and lots of very, very big snakes. Can be rather intimidating if you're not used to being around snakes. But the fort itself is a beautiful historic artifact that is largely intact, despite the fact that it has been abandoned basically since the 1920s when the U.S. government abandoned the property. Completely overgrown and also significantly filled in by earth. Look at this photograph. What you see in this photograph is the interior of Fort St. Philip, and you're looking at the parade ground area. This is the fort's primary magazine, and a word about that. A magazine is a structure in a fort. It's not, a clip with bullets in it that you put inside a pistol or a rifle. The historic term comes from a structure that was in all fortifications, and the magazine was where they stored the gunpowder. And the gunpowder was just as important as the guns themselves, just as important as the fort itself, because the magazine, keeping the gunpowder in it, supplied the guns and made the guns capable of firing. Without guns, a troop of determined Girl Scouts could capture a fort. So you had to have a central storage facility for your gunpowder. And you're looking at the principal powder magazine inside Fort St. Philip. This is part of the Spanish construction, so it's very early. It's 18th century. And this little arch here, pay close attention to that little arch there. That's actually the top of a doorway. So when you walked in, that was the arch that was about a foot above your head. And look where the ground is. This is a doorway that you have to imagine and picture being about 8 feet tall. So you've gotten about 7 feet worth of earth fill in the interior of the fort. And that's a result of that 1915 hurricane that wrecked much of Fort Livingston on Barataria Bay. That same hurricane and its tidal surge and its gale force winds blew a great quantity of earth into the center of Fort St. Philip. It was never re-excavated, so it's like that today, largely filled in. You don't get an idea at all of what it would have looked like, because when you go in there, the entire parade ground area is filled in with dirt. Also, lots of cows wandering around there and leaving little cow patties everywhere, so you got to watch your step when you're there. But now we move in a little bit closer to the city of New Orleans, to some of the other fortifications that were built in the pre-Civil War period. When we get to the other fortification that is run as a park, like I said, 8 forts in this state, a very heavily defended target. New Orleans was very heavily defended. And the reason that the U.S. government spends great quantities of money for the defense of the city of New Orleans is because, first of all, the British almost captured the damn thing in 1814, and then secondly, it was the United States' largest shipping port. The U.S. government recognized the fact that it was insanely valuable because of the fact that all of the wealth of the Mississippi River Valley would pass down through New Orleans on the way out to do business with the French, the Spanish, everyone of Europe, and the rest of the world. So with all that great quantity of commerce coming down the Mississippi River, passing the city of New Orleans was very valuable as a choke point, as a transshipment point, and as a major port. In fact, in the pre-Civil War period, New Orleans, in fact, in the pre-1830s, New Orleans was the busiest shipping port in the entire country. It would soon be surpassed by New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore, but New Orleans, to this very day, ranks among the top ports in this country. And the U.S. government recognized that in the 19th century, building these forts to protect that very, very valuable port. So, closer into the city, the U.S. government builds a series of forts flanking on the east side of New Orleans, and those forts were built around places where action actually took place during the War of 1812. During the War of 1812, the British sent forces through Lake Borgne. This is Lake Borgne here. But the British also probed up through Pass Rigolets. And Pass Rigolets is a pass connecting Lake Pontchartrain and Lake Borgne with Mississippi Sound. Rigolets is unlike some of the other waterways. One thing to keep in mind is that Lake Pontchartrain, average depth 15 feet. Lake Borgne, average depth 15 feet. It connects to the Mississippi Sound into the Gulf of Mexico, which gets gradually deeper and deeper and deeper. You get some deep points like the Mississippi River right in front of the French Quarter. The depth of the river there is almost 200 feet. So very, very deep water. But all of the little tributaries, bayous, and waterways around the Mississippi River are far more shallow, except for the Rigolets. Pass Rigolets can get very deep. And that's because you have all this vast tidal action of Lake Pontchartrain spilling out and cycling out, funneling through Pass Rigolets into the Gulf of Mexico and Mississippi Sound. And what that does is it washes all the sediment at the bottom of that pass and keeps it sort of deep. Went out on a fishing boat with one of those little Bassmaster depth gauges in front of Fort Pike once, out in the middle of the Rigolets, and it was 75 feet deep, which is an impressive depth considering that everything around it is very shallow. So the Rigolets is a very valuable thing, and when the British came to attack New Orleans in 1814, 1815, they would ultimately move through Lake Borgne, but they did so after they probed up around this area. Now, there was an American fort on this little point of land right here in 1815 called Fort Petit Coquille, but it's not there anymore. It was only a temporary fort. Immediately after the war, the U.S. realized that that fort being there stopped the British from coming through the Rigolets, so the U.S. government decided to go in and build a permanent fort made of brick, and that's what you get, Fort Pike. This is Fort Pike, an aerial view of the fortification. Here's Highway 90, Rigolets Bridge. This is the Rigolets out here. The south is at the top of the picture. But Fort Pike, located right here, is a small fort. It's a narrow waterway that doesn't really require a large fort. So you get a nice small little fortification with this circular curved waterfront. You'd have about 13 guns and casemates on the lower level, about 15 guns firing over the roof battery. So it was a well-defended pass. And then on the back side here, you see this little point here. That's a bastion to protect the fort from the land. If you ever get a chance to go out to Fort Pike, it's only about 25 miles from Canal Street, and it's run as a little park. It's a nice park to go visit. And they also have a couple of guns at Fort Pike still. This is a view of the Sally Port. That's what we call it. You can't even just call it the entrance. It's the Sally Port. view of the sally port, but this is an important thing right here. That's a 32-pounder smoothbore gun, and that's basically the atomic weapon of the 1830s and 40s. That was the weapon that could produce the maximum amount of damage to an enemy. So you have to equate it to something of great power in this day and age, and something of great power now is an atomic weapon. This was the heaviest weapon used to enforce the foreign policy and will of a nation in the time period of the 1820s and 1830s. Solid iron, sometimes made of brass, but in the case of heavier armament like a 32-pounder, solid iron guns with a smooth bore, meaning that the tube that projectile would pass down is just a smooth tube, not rifled like you see in later periods. And they would fire a 32-pound round ball that was about that big around. This is an interesting point of the evolution of weapons, because in the period that we're talking about here, 1820s, 1830s, that's the heaviest weapon available. A 32-pound gun, a gun capable of throwing a 32-pound round ball accurately out to maybe a mile. The evolution is incredible when you consider that it moves along, development moves along, and when you get to the Civil War in the 1860s, we develop guns that are capable of firing a 430-pound ball accurately out to about a mile. So it's incredible to visualize that this is the heaviest weapon available in the 1820s. 20 years later, you have weapons that are 100 times more powerful. And then even those weapons would pale in comparison to the weapons that we're using at the turn of the 20th century. But anyway, Fort Pike, similar in certain respects to Fort Massachusetts on Ship Island, Mississippi, in that you have casemates, and you can see these arched ways. Those are entrances to casemates, and a casemate, once again, is just a room made of thick, heavy masonry to protect a gun. And then you also had guns on the roof battery firing over a masonry parapet, as you see right there. Highway 90 bridge in the background. Fort Pike has an exact twin called Fort Macomb, which is 9 miles closer into the city of New Orleans at Pass Chef Mentor. Chef Mentor is another little narrow pass that connects Lake Bourne, and this is Chef Mentor here, to Lake Pontchartrain. The reason that it's valuable to protect Lake Pontchartrain as an avenue of approach is because an enemy, if an enemy could get into Lake Pontchartrain, they could land on the lake shore, and the lake shore in the early 1800s was pretty far away from the city of New Orleans. There wasn't development that went all the way up to the lake shore, but there was a bayou, Bayou St. John. And Bayou St. John fed straight from the lake shore, straight down to within about 2 miles of the city of New Orleans itself. So an enemy, if they could get into Lake Pontchartrain, they could send smaller vessels down Bayou St. John, and those smaller vessels could deliver infantry within 2 or 3 miles of the city of New Orleans. So you had to keep the enemy out of Lake Pontchartrain. The U.S. government did so by building Fort Pike on the Rigolets and Fort Macomb at Chef Mentor. And once again, making use of a big bend in the waterway, building the fort so that its guns point toward a bend where sailing ships would have to slow down, where they would have to negotiate the bend in the river, placing them in the disadvantaged position. Fort Macomb is identical in form to Fort Pike. This is another aerial shot. This is Highway 90, and this is the Chef Mentor Bridge. And you can see the same curved waterfront as Fort Pike and the same landward bastion to protect Fort Pike. And you see this big structure right back here? That's a marina. Today, there is a marina that is built dangerously close to Fort Pike, and it is undermining the walls of Fort Pike because of the wave action of the boats. Fort Macomb, also abandoned and forgotten, owned by the state of Louisiana, but not run or administered or interpreted as a park. It's a significant amount of overgrowth, and visiting this place is also like visiting the Venezuelan jungle in terms of snakes and mosquitoes and things like that. And also a water moat that surrounds the fort. You can barely see it in the photograph, but this is the marina off to here, and the wave action of boats moving back and forth out of that marina has been chipping away the masonry of the fort. And so somebody at one point came in and built this little anemic wooden wall that was supposed to protect the fort, and it doesn't really protect it. So it's a bit of a shame, because we have this wonderful historic structure that is a very valuable cultural resource, and it's not really appreciated to the full extent. There are buildings in the French Quarter that are much younger than this historic military structure, and yet they are administered as historic sites, and they're much better treated than poor old Fort Macomb is. The U.S. government also builds some forts very close in here in St. Bernard Parish. It builds a series of 3, and these 3 are, in certain respects, the most interesting of all the forts in the state. You start off with Tower Dupree, right here at Bayou Dupree. And the reason that the government comes in and builds 3 just in St. Bernard Parish alone is that St. Bernard Parish and Lake Bourne is the avenue that the British use in 1814 to get in to land 3,000 infantry that ultimately fight the Battle of New Orleans. They use one of 3 waterways to get in. The British would ultimately use Bayou Bienvenue up here, but this was also a vulnerable spot for the defense of New Orleans because Bayou Dupree would allow small vessels on Lake Bourne to enter the bayou, sail down the bayou to its end, landing infantry on the firm, hard ground that's on the bank of the river. The river tends to build up nice, firm, solid ground on its banks. Everything about 2 miles inland from the riverbank turns into marsh and swamp, so that this area all out in here is real marshy and swampy, but the area on either side of the river, immediately flanking the river, is the hard ground that infantry can walk over. So it was recognized that Bayou Dupree was a weak point, and the government comes in and builds this structure. You'll sometimes hear people call this Martello Castle or Martello Tower, and a Martello Tower is a specific type of fortification that was designed by the Portuguese in the 17th century. And this does not really incorporate the design features of a Martello Tower, so it's a bit of an abuse of the term to refer to it as either a Martello Tower or Martello Castle. It is a tower design in that you had this tower that would have guns in it, and on the lower level it had rifle ports for infantrymen to use basically rifle or small arms to fire on anyone approaching, and then you had a second level that had some heavy guns like 32-pounders, and then you had a roof battery. The interesting thing about this place is that it was purchased by a private owner, owned by a private owner for many years, and converted into a fishing camp. And that's what was done here. This structure is all modern structure. That's not part of the original historic structure. But what the private owners did was when they purchased the fort, they shaved off about the top 5 feet of the masonry, historic masonry, 19th century masonry, dumped it into the water right below the fort, so that in this water all around it, you see all the original bricks at the top level. And they built their fishing camp using modern roofing and like aluminum roofing and wooden tiling and so forth, converted the whole structure into a fishing camp, and I'll show you some photographs of the fishing camp in a moment. But here's an interesting detail about Tower Dupree. This is the mouth of Bayou Dupree. It continues on over here. This structure here was not originally around. This is the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet Canal, which is a major avenue for shipping traffic to get at sort of the short route to the Gulf of Mexico, coming off the Mississippi River. Here's Fort Dupree, or Tower Dupree, sitting right here out in the water, and you can see it's well away from the shore. When Tower Dupree was built, beginning in 1828, it was built on the lake shore. And that gives you an idea of how much of shoreline recession that there has been. This shoreline used to be out here. It has receded to this point now where Tower Dupree sits several hundred yards out into Lake Bourne. That's how much the lake is backing up. We see that in one of the other forts dramatically as well. But as I mentioned, Tower Dupree was converted into a fishing camp, and that's what it looks like on the inside now. You can see when these guys converted the place, what they did was they brought in bunks. This is the lowest level of the fort. They brought in bunks. On the second level, they have, in fact, this huge kitchen area. And to this day, the kitchen's in there. There's an old wore-out TV in there. And they even have a generator that's still there. And they generated their own power so they could get in there and drink beer and fish and watch TV and get beer out of the cooler. It must have been a redneck paradise. But you'll see these little openings right here. Those are called rifle loopholes, and this is the lower level of the fort, and the lower level was designed to defend against infantry. If infantry got close to the fort, riflemen would aim a musket through that port and could lay small arms fire on anyone getting close to the fort. You can see here's the bottom, and just like at Fort St. Philip, there's been a significant amount of earth intrusion into the historic structure, so that the ground level now is here, just a matter of inches from the bottom of the rifle ports, but that ground level used to be about 4 feet lower so that infantry could stand on the ground level and fire a musket through the opening. Moving a little bit further north is definitely the sexiest of all the forts in the state. Battery Bayou Bienvenue. And Battery Bayou Bienvenue was built at probably the most important strategic location in coastal Louisiana, because this is where the British came in. The British got to the plain of Chalmette and fought that battle only because of Bayou Bienvenue. Bayou Bienvenue feeds in off of Lake Borgne here, and can, by turning off of Bayou Bienvenue onto this little bayou here, the English were able to get within a mile of the river, and they marched up to about right here where the two S's are right there in Mississippi, and that's where the Battle of New Orleans was fought. They were guided there by Portuguese fishermen. They sailed in. The British got their infantry ashore using longboats. They had to row ashore from way out here, but they rowed ashore, entering through Bayou Bienvenue and getting the ground forces assembled right here on the bank of the Mississippi River, and that's why the Battle of New Orleans was fought. But Bayou Bienvenue was obvious. It was obvious in the post-war of 1812 period. If the British got in there, we obviously have to build a fort there. So the U.S. government comes in and builds a battery there beginning in 1828. And it's not a full-blown fort like Fort Massachusetts or Fort St. Philip or Fort Jackson, but it is just an open-top battery. In other words, you have a brick wall that would protect the guns behind it, but it's open in the back. There's no full enclosure like you see at some of the other fortifications. And that's because it's out in the middle of the marsh. No one's going to approach this thing on the ground because there basically is no ground. It's in the middle of the marsh. You just build a brick face to protect the guns, and that's sufficient to defend the battery. So the brick face kind of stretches along as a little polygon. And behind it, like I mentioned with St. Philip, is the principal magazine for powder storage for the guns. But the interesting and sexy part about Bayou Bienvenue is the fact that some of the guns are still there. 6 original 32-pounder and 42-pounder weapons that were put there in 1837. They're still sitting there to this very day. And every one of them in good shape and capable of being fired again because they have open vent holes. The guns were originally on wooden carriages. And those wooden carriages over the years rotted away. And because the wooden carriages rotted away, the guns were just laying in the dirt for years and years and years. Someone finally came along in 1959, right on the verge of the centennial of the Civil War, and built these little concrete piers and put the guns up on them, used their trunnions to put them up on the piers there. So the guns are all 6 of them built on these little concrete structures that hold them up. But all 6 of them are there, and it's a pretty impressive sight when you pull up to this fort and you go walking through. And in fact, I got the worst case of poison ivy I ever got in my life at this place. And it's totally overgrown, but you can go hack your way through there, and you push back some weeds and some shrubs, and there's an 1842 manufactured 32-pounder smoothbore gun. It's a pretty impressive sight if you're into this sort of thing. But like I said, Bayou Bienvenue still has 6 of its original weapons. It's a very, very impressive sight to see. But then on the lower extremity of Lake Borgne, here at Bayou Eklosky, close to the city, the township of Shell Beach, you can't even really call that a city, can you, is Fort Proctor. Fort Proctor, once again, defending another one of the little bayous that feeds off of Lake Borgne that would allow infantry to get in, to penetrate into the interior, and get on to the firm ground of the riverbank. The U.S. government comes in beginning in 1856, so it's a little bit later. The U.S. government comes in and builds this structure. This is Fort Proctor. You will also hear it referred to as Fort Beauregard, because the superintending engineer on the construction of this fort was none other than Pierre Gustave Toussaint Beauregard, who was a Confederate general during the Civil War. And people will frequently abuse the name and call it Fort Beauregard. It was named Fort Proctor by the United States government, though. Fort Proctor, like Tower Dupree, was originally built on the lakeshore, but there's been a significant amount of recession, so the lakeshore actually scooted back out from under the fort. So the fort is now out in the lake, once again Lake Borgne. It's got this little ripraps seawall that was built around it to protect it, but it sits out there isolated in the water, like Tower Dupree does. But Fort Proctor is interesting and unique in that it incorporates steel girder construction, or rather iron girder construction. Most of these forts are masonry through and through, so they're just brick through and through. But later in the construction period, they were experimenting with different types of construction and also different construction materials. And so what you see today is a brick fort with brick fascia, but with iron reinforcing girders to support the floor weight. And a lot like Tower Dupree, it's a tower, so that you'd have on the lowest level loopholes and so forth, so that riflemen could defend against infantry, and that's why you have these long rifle slits, that real long, so that one guy could actually kneel and shoot through when somebody could stand above him and shoot through as well. But then on the second level, you had openings for heavy armament, for 32-pounders, and then a roof battery for very, very heavy armament as well. But then when, this is in the pre-Civil War period, but as you get to the post-Civil War period, new types of weapons are being used. There's a great deal of scientific development during the Civil War because one of the themes that you see through history is that humankind really gets their act together and really gets things moving and cooking in terms of the development of new inventions when we're trying to kill each other, because we're always trying to come up with new ways to kill each other better. So the Civil War leads to this explosion of the development of weaponry. I mentioned that in the 1820s and 1830s, the heaviest weapons that were available were weapons that could fire a 32-pound ball. In the 1860s, the U.S. government developed this, the Rodman Columbiad. And the Rodman Columbiad in the 15-inch version, which you see pictured here, and these are weapons on display at Fort Moultrie at Charleston, South Carolina. These weapons, 15-inch Rodman Columbiads, were capable of firing a 434-pound round ball. So the development in just about 25 years goes from the heaviest weapon being 32-pounder to the heaviest weapon being a 434-pounder. So you suddenly have a gun that can throw 434 pounds of iron accurately out to about a mile. And when you have a 434-pound round ball of iron descending on a target, that's much more kinetic energy than what was capable in the 1830s. 32 pounds of iron going boom, 32 pounds of iron traveling at 1,600 feet per second is certainly a respectable amount of energy, but 434 pounds of iron moving at 1,600 feet per second is a heck of a lot more power, and that power really threatened the development, the continued construction of masonry fortifications. So you don't see masonry fortifications being built after the Civil War, and it's largely because of the development of guns of extremely heavy caliber. In the 1870s, the U.S. government comes in and builds batteries for these incredibly heavy Rodman Columbiads, and you get some batteries like that down the river. And then you get also the development of newer types of weapon, particularly breech-loading rifles. And at the turn of the century, around about the time of the Spanish-American War in 1898, the U.S. government begins a new program of construction of coastal defenses, moving away from the old brick construction and the old smoothbore guns. The U.S. government begins building guns using concrete as a primary construction material, and then also the types of guns that go in these fortifications are vastly improved. In this case, you're looking at around the turn of the century, the crew of a 12-pounder breech-loading or 12-inch breech-loading rifle and a disappearing carriage. And the 12-inch breech-loading rifle is vastly impressive when you consider it compared to weapons of the Civil War. The heaviest weapon of the Civil War was the 15-inch Rodman Columbiad, firing 434-pound ball, accurate out to about 1 mile. In 1898, the U.S. government is using weapons like this, 12-inch breech-loading rifles, and weapons like this are capable of firing a 1,049-pound projectile accurately out 9 miles. So suddenly, artillery can rain down on targets with great force 10 miles away. They're barely over the horizon at that range. So no more does the ship come up visible over the horizon than you can use a weapon like this to drop 1,000-pound shells on it. So the firepower of artillery has taken dramatic steps forward, and it influences the construction of forts. No longer do you have these architecturally beautiful masonry forts. You get these kind of ugly concrete forts, but they're far more powerful and far more functional than the product of the early 19th century. And what you get at the Mississippi River is the development of new batteries to house these new weapons. At Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, the U.S. government comes in and builds a host of batteries. No longer are we calling them forts particularly, but they build a series of concrete batteries to house brand new armament, and they give these batteries names. And you can see on the Fort St. Philip, this is the Fort St. Philip side of the river, they build Battery Pike, Battery Force, Battery Brook, Battery Ridgely. And these are all batteries built out flanking the old Spanish fort. So you get an interesting layering effect of history. You have a fort built by the Spanish in the 1780s. You have improvements that were made to it by the Americans in the 1800s. You have a Civil War battle there, and then you have concrete battles from the batteries from the 1890s flanking this structure. It makes for an interesting historical visit. And then on the Fort Jackson side, Battery Ransom and Battery Miller, actually one of them, Battery Miller, or Battery Ransom rather, being built right inside the middle of Fort Jackson. Inside the middle of the 19th century historic structure, you get a 20th century historic structure. So again, that layering effect of history. And again, the reason that the structures are built and focused at the mouth, or at this bend of the river, is because once again, the river makes this dramatic bend, 75 or thereabouts, about 75 miles south of New Orleans, about 40 miles north of the mouth of the river. Any ship that would get up to the river and begin to make this bend would come under the direct gunfire of the batteries at Fort St. Philip and the batteries at Fort Jackson. So this firepower would be sufficient to stop any enemy from attempting to get up the mouth of the Mississippi River. And there were a variety of weapons that were used on the St. Philip side and the Fort Jackson side, ranging from small to large. This is the smallest end of it. This is a 3-inch rapid-fire gun. This type of gun could be fired 4 or 5 rounds a minute. You could fire it rapidly, and it was very effective, although light, very effective against fast-moving targets like motor torpedo boats. Anything that could move quickly, you could lay rapid fire on it, even as it moved. You could continue to train the gun around it, traverse it, and lay gunfire on that ship as it tries to pass your fort. There's another shot of the same piece. These guns are emplaced at Battery McCorkle, I think it is, at Harbor Defenses of Charleston, South Carolina, at Fort Moultrie. And then another type of weapon that was used was the 4.72-inch Armstrong gun. This gives you the fact that it's an Armstrong gun is interesting. Armstrong was a British arms manufacturing company, and the United States of America was so underdeveloped in terms of building artillery that we had to buy surplus guns from the British for a while. And there were some weapons like this at Battery Ridgely on the Fort St. Philip side of the river. There's another shot of it. An interesting feature of this gun is the breech. This is the breech end of it. You've got muzzle and breech. Now, in the pre-Civil War period and the Civil War period, you had to load at the muzzle. But in the post-Civil War period and at the turn of the 20th century, you load from this end at the breech. These are 12-inch breech-loading mortars, a type of weapon that could fire a 300-pound projectile almost straight up in the air, and that could drop straight down on the deck of a ship. So these weapons would have been very, very destructive. But then you get the disappearing carriage gun. The disappearing carriage gun was developed by the U.S. government shortly before the turn of the 20th century, and the terms disappearing carriage refer to the mounting system. And in batteries like this is a concrete battery. You'd have 2 guns usually, 12-inch guns, firing 1,000-pound projectiles accurate out to 9 miles. These guns could be held in one of 2 positions. You had the up position where it would fire, and you can see it there. And in the up position, the weapon itself was all alone above the concrete of the battery. In the load position, you see the position here, you have the crew, and it took literally a crew of men to load and fire the weapon. The crew is down here loading and servicing and preparing the weapon to fire its next shot. And these guys are below the concrete wall, protected on all sides by concrete. When the weapon was ready to fire, they would trip a release lever. A counterweight would move down a shaft and lift the gun up so that it was in this position above the concrete. It's a very intricate and impressive mechanical invention, and it made it possible for these gun crews to be protected at all times by concrete. But then during World War II, coast defenses changed again. Now the massive concrete gun batteries with 12-inch guns, those ceased to be used in the 1920s. In the 1920s, the U.S. government downsizes the military, and we no longer man these coast artillery locations throughout the country. We no longer keep U.S. Coast Artillery troops at Fort Jackson or Fort St. Philip, and they get abandoned at that point. But the U.S. government during World War II brings in coast artillery defenses once again. And the U.S. government brings in a different variety of weapons in the 1940s. And it's important to build defenses on the Gulf Coast in World War II because in the summer of 1942, German submarines were operating off the mouth of the Mississippi River, sinking ships. During the summer of 1942, German submarines sank 56 ships in the Gulf of Mexico, most of them right off the mouth of the Mississippi River. But during World War II, coast artillery weapons ranged from everything from 50 caliber water-cooled anti-aircraft machine guns to 3-inch anti-aircraft cannon to 16-inch weapons. This is a weapon that by itself cost over $300,000 to manufacture in 1942, 60 years ago. There's one in a concrete protective casemate. Then you also get smaller weapons like this 6-inch gun. This is a 6-inch gun in Battery 234 in Pensacola, Florida. There's another shot of it. And this type of weapon allowed the crew to be protected by this shield, and the result of that was they called them shield guns. But the weapon that was used in Louisiana during World War II to defend the coast was the 155 millimeter gun. They called them GPFs. And the Coast Artillery used GPFs mounted on a concrete base plate system called a Panama mount. This is a photograph of a Panama mount at Fort Morgan, Alabama, where one of these 155 millimeter guns would have been mounted. The reason they called them Panama mounts was that the type of mounting apparatus was developed in the Panama Canal Zone. But 155 millimeter guns were used everywhere to defend the U.S. government. They were used here to defend the U.S. and the interior. They were used here in Louisiana. These are just some shots of one and a crew around it. Another shot there, and you can see the concrete base plate. And there's one just after firing. 155 millimeter guns were mounted at 3 places in Louisiana. They were mounted at the temporary harbor defenses of Port Eads at the South Pass of the Mississippi River, the temporary harbor defenses of Burwood, Louisiana on the Southwest Pass, and at Calcasieu Pass. You had 2 batteries at Burwood on the South Pass, at Port Eads on the South Pass, Burwood on the Southwest Pass, and there was also a naval section base at Burwood. These are some shots of it from 1942. But then you also had temporary harbor defenses at Calcasieu Pass, which defended Calcasieu Lake with Lake Charles at the top of it, and mounted there, right here at the pass. You can see the pass also allowed some shipping to move out into the open Gulf of Mexico. And you had 2 guns in dispersed locations on the west side of the pass, and then you had a headquarters battery located inland behind it. And that represents all of the weapons that were used in Louisiana's coast defense history. I appreciate you guys and all your attention. Thank you.